your dragon legends could actually be stories about what we today call dinosaurs.
The reason why you don't find the word dinosaur in the Bible is the same reason why you don't find words like computer or locomotive, because all of those words were invented in the English language well after the Bible was translated into English.
The word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841 by Sir Richard Owen, who was head of the British Museum. Before that, words such as dragon were used in the Bible.
The King James Bible was first translated into English in 1611, so the word dinosaur is a modern word.
There is a distinct philosophy that is able to be identified when you look at the King James Version of the Bible that was first printed in 1611 to the more modern translations in the English language like the ESV. In 1611, they used the word dragon 35 times. In the Old Testament alone, they used the plural word dragon 16 times. But if you look at the ESV today, they use the word dragons in the plural form 0. And what is very clear to see is that whenever dragon is used to refer to a real living, breathing creature that walks upon land, the ESV has decided that that is not a word that can be used. Most of the time they replace it with jackal, which is like a little hairy dog. Now that is a big discrepancy between a small, hairy, fox-like creature and a big, gigantic reptile-like creature. And what you see is that the evolutionary mindset has seeped into to so many things that we have even our most conservative Bible theologians look at dragons. They do not make the connection between dragon and dinosaur, and they have the idea that, wow, dragons aren't real, so we have to protect the inerrancy of the Bible.
Most of the people believe that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, and therefore humans couldn't possibly have seen them because they haven't been around that long. So it's a case of a faulty view of history with this millions of years imposed upon it, which means they have to try to explain away human encounters with creatures which we would call dragons.
But sometimes we treat God like he's a little old lady that needs help crossing the street. You know, no, I believe that God said what he means, and he means what he said. So if dinosaurs and dragons really are one and the same, one might actually ask, well, why did dragons fade into mythology to begin with? And that's a really good question.
So you had all cultures in the world essentially passing on stories about big lizards. And over time, those stories get corrupted, they get distorted. It's a fish story of the day, you know, they get this added or that added, and all of a sudden they become magical and they cast spells in at least a modern fantasy literature.
It was not until around the year 1800 that a French scientist named Georges Cuvier started to publish his findings that the extinction of a species was actually possible. Before that time, no one thought that species could go extinct. They actually thought that God had a kind of a supernatural preservation on all the species of the world. The reason they thought that was an errant view of the Bible. They go back to Genesis and said, you know, the God created all the creatures and that it was good. So they thought that at that point that there was kind of a supernatural preservation on that. That then got reinforced again when the flood came. And the story of Noah's flood is that God was going to cleanse the planet and was going to basically start over and with Noah and his family. Well, he had Noah bring all the animal kinds 2 by 2 to the ark. And again, there was this sense of preservation.
We didn't invent the word dinosaur until the 1800s. And so anything before the 1800s could not have used the word dinosaur. And so no Bible translations would use the word dinosaur prior to the 1800s. And since then, no Bible translation would dare to use the word dinosaur because of the pressure from the evolutionists.
So people before the 1800s, as they're hearing the stories of dragons, they're looking around and saying, I don't see that creature alive today, and if it is not alive today, then it was never alive. And that is how and why dragons fade into mythology.
There are a lot of things that over the years have been found that were thought to have been extinct. Some mammals, some fishes, some plants. The coelacanth was a classic example from the early 1900s. The Wollemi pine, which was discovered in the later 1900s. So there's a lot of things that pop up that no one thought everyone thought went extinct. But it turns out that they're still here and they're essentially unchanged from the way they were supposedly millions of years ago.
And also there's an Australian living fossil that's very well known. It's called the Wollemi pine, and it was found in a very isolated part of a conservation reserve near Sydney in New South Wales, and it quickly became known as the dinosaur tree. because they said it had lived alongside the dinosaurs, and the initial dating of the Wallamai pine fossils was that it had been thought to be extinct for many millions of years.
Now, when they found this Wallamai pine just a short time ago, the curator of the Sydney Botanical Gardens apparently said it's just like finding a live dinosaur. I think he said a live small dinosaur, because the point is it has exactly the same significance.
Now, the coelacanth is a fish. Fossils have been found of this fish that the evolutionists say died out, say, 70 million years ago, came on the scene about 400 million years ago. The reality is, in 1938, off of the island of Madagascar, fishermen started catching coelacanths. And so now the evolutionist is presented with a problem. If coelacanths died out 75 million years ago, what's a live one doing in 1938? And they found a lot more of them. Some are even in aquariums today.
Here's an interesting thing. Years ago, when I was in undergraduate school in Minnesota, I was taking a course in botany, and our professor took us all outside the botany building to pay obeisance to a ginkgo tree. And we all stood around in just deep reverence looking at this ginkgo tree, because we were told that this ginkgo tree, we can see it in the fossil record back to the time of the dinosaurs and beyond, and here it is growing alive and well just outside of our botany building. And isn't that amazing? And boy, we were impressed. But you know, now that I look back on that, why didn't our prof just show us the far more abundant oak trees and elm trees? Because they're in the fossil record too. We have acorns, we have walnuts, and these are dating back 40, 50 million years. No, I don't accept these dates. I believe the Earth is 6,000 years old. But if you're going to accept these dates, we have a tank here in the Creation Museum that is full of native Kentucky aquatic creatures. Sunfish, which have been found, the good old sunny you fish for, you know, if you like to fish. They were around back, according to the fossil record, 40, 50 million years ago. Garfish go back at least as far as the dinosaurs. We have the short-nosed gar in the tank. Turtles, 120 million years. Bats, 60 million years, 50 million years, and they look just like the bats do today.
Amber is what I call a time capsule. It is some amber is supposed to be up to 50 million years old, and quite a bit of amber has what are called inclusions in it. Now, inclusions can be insects, they could be water, they could be oxygen or air bubbles, if you will. And the reason I call amber a time capsule is, lo and behold, when we find, for example, ants and termites, we've even found the pine bark beetle that is decimating the forests in the Rocky Mountain West. These animals, or these insects, if you will, are exactly the same as what we have today.
The Jurassic shrimp was supposed to become extinct during the Jurassic time, and yet they're alive and well and just as delicious today as back in the alleged evolutionary past. And so these living fossils, I think, are clear testimony to the youth of this Earth.
Terrified, the man pushed his daughters behind him and said, "Oh God, you are wonderful and powerful and created such amazing creatures. Please don't let him eat my daughters. As you love all your creation, I love them." Then he turned and plunged back into the ocean.
According to conventional wisdom, the dinosaurs lived from about 250 million years ago to about 65 million years ago. The reason why they say that is after the so-called Cretaceous layers, you don't find any more dinosaur fossils above there. So they believe the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago. And they believe that man only evolved in the last 2 million years, say, because we only find human fossils at the very top of the layers. And so man and dinosaurs, in their view, could never have lived together because they would be separated by over 60 million years.
An evolutionist would look at the fossil record, and they would, based on their idea that the Earth is ancient and that the present is the key to the past, and they would look at natural processes which act very slowly, they would say, therefore, the fossil record must have accumulated very slowly. And because it's such a slow process, it's actually, you can look at it and look at different eras of time. And so in this section, these fossils are buried. That means that these fossils are alive at one point in time. And then if there's a layer that appears above that, well, that must be a later period of time. There's a different set of fossils being buried there. That's a snapshot of a different period of time. And then they build this very elaborate tree structure of all of life, and they build this very elaborate model of the geologic record.
Well, basically what they do is look at the sedimentary rock units in the Jurassic layer, and they find some dinosaurs there, and they say because we find dinosaurs here, this particular layer is at least 70, 75 million years old. And so it is a tautology where they date the fossils by the rock layers, and they date the rock layers by the fossils that they find in them. And so it is a cause for circuitous or circular reasoning.
I did 1 year of geology in my university, and it's interesting that the head of the department said the fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution. He said this plainly. He made it clear he was not a creationist, but he did say the fossil record seems to support a series of divine creations. This I heard from the professor of geology. And professor in New Zealand was the highest rank of university teachers, not just any old lecturer.
Well, fossils are formed only in special circumstances. I'm a marine biologist. I'm a scuba diver. I lost count after about 500 scuba dives. And it's funny because most people think marine biologists study whales and dolphins, but really most marine biologists study worms and bacteria and mud. And so in my life, I've studied a lot of mud. I've dug mud in lakes, rivers, and streams all over the southeast. I'll look at the sediments all up and down the Florida Keys or in the Bahamas, in Belize, one trip to the South Pacific, which was very nice. And all that digging and all that sand and all that dirt and all that mud, I've never found a fish skeleton. I've never found an incipient fossil. I've never found something that was being fossilized. Because fish, when they die, when they finally do hit the bottom, they're eaten by everything. And usually they're eaten on the way down. And so their bones seem to be scattered all over the place, and their flesh is destroyed. And even if they land in the mud, the bones dissolve over time in the water made of calcium carbonate, is soluble in seawater. It takes special circumstances to make a fossil. And most of those circumstances are met by Noah's flood, where you have a very rapid amount of sedimentation. We have lots of fossils being buried very quickly, being sealed off away from oxygen, and then being impregnated by the minerals that dissolve in the water that can recrystallize inside those bones, prevent them from dissolving away, and you get a fossil.
I believe those dinosaurs were buried in sediment at the time of Noah's flood, which would have been about 4,000 years ago. So either at the time of the flood or at some point after the flood during the runoff, because all the dinosaurs that we know of, with rare exception, are buried in water-deposited sediment. As Ken Ham says, if there really was a worldwide flood, you'd expect to see billions of things buried in rock layers deposited by water all over the earth, and what you really see are billions of dead things buried in rock layers deposited by water all over the earth. And that is certainly true of the dinosaurs, and when you read about them, they always are described as having wandered too close to an inland sea or lake. They got a little tipsy and fell in. And before their flesh could rot, before scavengers could eat it, they became encased in a very cementatious rock. This isn't going on today. I have rabbits and squirrels in my backyard. I don't know what happens to them when they die. I've never seen any little rabbit funerals or anything like that. And I'll tell you, they're certainly not making fossils.
You can't get a fossil if a dinosaur died in the forest. It's going to rot away and get scavenged, and you can see that in the farms today. You don't see sheep and cattle fossilizing. You have to bury them quickly, and when you have something like a global flood, you're going to bury lots of creatures, and that's why we find lots of fossil dinosaur graveyards where they've been washed in, like the Iguanodon graveyard. Which makes sense if you've got a huge catastrophe, a watery catastrophe. And of course, when you have a watery catastrophe, you don't need millions of years to explain the rock layers either.
Right behind me is what is called a polystrate fossil. Poly meaning many, straight meaning strata. So here's a fossil that is straight up and down, going through many layers of strata. And what is significant about that? Well, first off, the conventional wisdom around here in the Hell Creek Formation is that it could take 1,000 years, a centimeter, to lay down all of the sedimentary deposits. Well, Is that polystrate fossil behind me going to wait around for 100,000 years while slowly all of the sediment is put in around it to hold it straight up? No. It's going to decompose, it's going to fall over long before that happened. It had to have been done very, very quickly.
There are some fish fossils that I've seen with exquisite preservation. All the scales, all the fins are intact, that the fish's mouth is closed, his gills are closed, which is an indication that he's buried in squish. In fact, the streamlines around the fish in the mud, it looks like he was struggling and trying to swim as he's being buried. We've got abundant evidence of rapid fossilization. There's some three-dimensional dinosaurs that are preserved where a dinosaur is crouching down and yet he's covered in mud, and the only way to do that is if the mud is accumulating so quickly that he's literally suffocated in the mud, because if he had died he would have fallen over, or at least would have laid down flat. But no, he's crouching, the mud covers all the way up above his head.
And Mount St. Helens is certainly an excellent example, because we saw things happen there that blew geologists' mind. May 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and next, in that major eruption and subsequent ones, up to 600 feet of rock layers, new material was deposited around Mount St. Helens. And at one particular level, we find a 20-foot horizon that was produced on June 12, 1980. We know the day and the year because people were there to observe it, so it's testable. You know, we've got reliable eyewitness accounts. But within that 20-foot thick layer, we have multiplicity of small layers, alternating coarse and fine-grained layers. Now, a geologist normally look at that with a millions of years belief system. We call it mental glasses. Looking through the idea of millions of years, who would have thought that each of those little bands would have taken thousands of years to accumulate, or alternating yearly sequences, and so the whole sequence, hundreds of them, would have taken hundreds of years. But we observed it to happen in just one day.
The rock layers are not a sequence of age, but a sequence of burial. Taking their age interpretation, they shouldn't be, the coelacanths have died out, yet we know they're living today. People will ask why are there no dinosaur and humans fossilized together. I would ask, why are there no coelacanths and whales fossil together, even though they live in the sea together? It's because they just weren't buried together.
Now, how do you explain that by slow and gradual processes with little local floods over millions of years? No, only a global flood can explain rock layers with marine fossils up on the continents that were catastrophically deposited and buried that swept right across the continents and between continents. I mean, the evidence is crying out for catastrophe. It screams Noah's flood, it therefore screams a young Earth.
You know, radiometric dating is seen as the linchpin of the evolutionary age of the Earth. They say, all these radiometric dating techniques show the Earth is ancient, so how can you believe in a young Earth? Well, actually, what I do is I appeal to known lava flows. Go to Hawaii, sample a lava flow, sample some basalt that's come out of the Earth, bring it back to your laboratory, tell me what age you measure. It's not going to be zero. It's not going to be even a few thousand years old. You're going to get an old age. It doesn't matter what technique you use. So what that does is that takes the idea that you can measure the difference between the daughter product and the parent product and calculate an age as if there was a clock. That discredits anything that's using the assumption that there's zero daughter products.
Well, I was involved in a project called the RATE project, R-A-T-E. It stands for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. It was an acronym that we put together to describe so people would quickly identify what this project was. And it was conducted between 1997 and 2005. And we got some exciting evidences that confirmed that the conclusion we came to was that the nuclear decay rates, radioactive decay rates, had been grossly accelerated at some time or times in the past. At some event, the decay rates had been accelerated, that had been speeded up to such an enormous extent that you could essentially have hundreds of millions of years worth of nuclear decay measured by the rates at which they occur today, all of that happening within a few thousand years. So one of the best examples we came up with, well, there are several good ones. There were tiny crystals found in a granite in New Mexico from a drill hole. And essentially, when uranium decays to lead, the parent decays to the daughter lead, the byproduct is helium. And helium gas it's chemically stable, It doesn't react with other elements. It's what we call an inert element or inert gas. Because it's only got small atoms, it could leak very easily out of those crystals. But we found that the uranium-lead date for these crystals, with the millions of years scenario, using the radioisotope dating, was 1.5 billion years. But most of the helium that would have been produced by that amount of nuclear decay was still in the crystals. So we made predictions. Then we sent the crystals to a well-recognised laboratory who was well known for doing that work to actually measure the rate of leakage. And where did it fit? Exactly on the 6,000 year prediction. In other words, while the uranium to lead clock had ticked at the rate of 1.5 billion years, that's 1,500 million years, while uranium had been ticking through that rate, helium had been leaking at a different rate. That means because we know of the law of leakage of these atoms, well-known physical law that we can reproduce in the laboratory, that was a far more credible age determination method.
There's some basalt flows that erupted on the rim of the Grand Canyon, flowed down into the canyon all the way to the base of the canyon. That means that the lava flow is younger than the canyon, younger than the uppermost sediments, and yet that lava flow dates to millions of years older than the canyon itself. It really raises the question, how do we know that these techniques are valid?
We've got other lines of evidence. There was about 3 or 4 lines of evidence that we found that all pointed in the same direction, that the assumption of nuclear decay rates always being constant at the rates we measure today isn't true, that they were accelerated in the past, and that means the clocks can't be trusted.
We have done carbon-14 dating on coal and diamonds, which are hugely old. Diamonds are supposed to be over 1 billion years old, and yet we find carbon-14 in them. Now, hang on, carbon-14 would have long just decayed if it were that old.
One of the discoveries that has really rocked the evolutionary world was made by Dr. Mary Schweitzer and Dr. Jack Horner from analyzing the interior, the bone marrow, if you will, of the thigh bone or the femur of a T-Rex that was excavated back in 2003. Their report was published in the March-April 2005 edition of Science Magazine, a very prestigious, peer-reviewed science magazine. And they reported, and to my left are pictures, just a few pictures, there's many more who are actually in the magazine. They reported soft, stretchable, elastic, snap-back like rubber band tissue in that thigh bone. In addition, they reported finding red blood vessels that still had blood cells in them and were identifiable. And all of that would be impossible if this dinosaur died out 65 to 68 million years ago. Clearly, science has shown this dinosaur died out very recently, and I would say perhaps as a result of the flood of Noah's day, just a matter of, say, 4,000 years ago.
Doctors Mary Schweitzer and Jack Horner are paleontologists. They study fossils. Specifically, they're interested in dinosaurs. In fact, I think you could call Jack Horner Mr. Dinosaur. I mean, he's probably associated with the study of dinosaurs as much or more than anyone else that comes to mind.
Mary Schweitzer said on one such test, she said she couldn't believe it until she'd done it 17 times. This is pretty thorough.
So most people are understandably shocked, and that includes certainly evolutionists, that you should find what appears to be fresh marrow. Still soft, still with blood vessels, still with red blood cells. More recently, they've gone beyond that. Schweitzer, working with other investigators, have looked at the biochemistry of the marrow, and they have indeed found protein fragments. Now, not the whole protein, but protein fragments. Proteins usually don't remain completely undisturbed for a few thousand years, and of course we have no idea for 70 million.
Well, of course, the evolutionary naturalists who embrace the long ages of evolution, who maintain adamantly that man and dinosaur are separate by 65 million years, are very, very uncomfortable with these continuing discoveries of Mary Schweitzer. Tom Kay of Seattle, who was also a critic of the first study of Mary Schweitzer, said, and I quote, "This will either be nothing or the biggest revolution in paleontology ever." You know, I would have to agree with the latter portion of his quote. This is one of the greatest paleontological discoveries ever.
Danny returned to his cave, deep in thought. What had made that man on the beach so brave? The man had spoken about someone who had created him. The man had spoken about a creator that loved all his creatures. Was Danny one of those creatures?
Most of your dinosaur books, if you go to Barnes & Noble or wherever, they're all millions of years, millions of years, millions of years. Kids have been to see those movies that talk about dinosaurs. They might be fictional movies, like Jurassic Park and so on, but at the same time, they still teach millions of years.
Ever since Darwin and Lyell, that this idea of many, many millions of years is a philosophical necessity, but is certainly not found in science.
I mean, the main movers and shakers at the time were really striving to discredit the Bible. I mean, Lyell himself said that his stated goal was to free the world from Moses. And if that's his stated goal, to free the world from Moses, he is actively trying to undermine the biblical account of creation.
So that's why we have to talk about the age of the earth issue if we want to talk about dinosaurs and humans, because these are two radically different views. And if the earth is young, then dinosaurs and man did live together. And the dragon legends are believable.
Paleontologists also, I believe, go ahead and fill in the gaps as they see them in the evolutionary timeline, going from monkeys to man, going from microbes to man. One of the things that they find, though, in the process of doing that is that life is very complex. Whether it's dead life or living life, it is still extremely complex. And so that means they've got to have huge amounts of time in order to give people any idea at all that it's credible to go from microbes to man. And that's really, time is the magic bullet for the evolutionist. It's a lot of time which makes the impossible possible.
Old Earth, old universe even, but certainly old Earth, 4.5 billion years, is important to the evolutionist because they need a great deal of time for things to evolve by the evolutionary process, which would involve random changes due to mutations and natural selection. I would suggest it requires infinitely more time than the pittance of 4.5 billion years. I encourage them to think along the lines of Google years. That would be to the Google power. I mean, you need years that make billions look like nothing if you're going to try to attribute to chance even a single biologically useful protein.
Well, they say that over billions of years anything is possible, but would you ever expect someone to win the lottery every single day for 10 years straight? That's essentially the odds that they're claiming anything is possible. If that happened, a court of law would call that guy guilty, send him to jail for the rest of his life because he's cheating. Even if they don't know how he's cheating, they would have to conclude that you are cheating because this is impossible. So their idea that anything is possible is really ridiculous on the face of it.
Would require more time and material than is in the known universe to have ever evolved by chance. Once you can buy all that and accept it, once you can accept photosynthesis having formed by chance, I don't see a hill of beans difference between believing it happened by chance in 6,000 years versus 6 billion years. I mean, one's just as improbable as the other. We've reached a point where the p-values are so low that what's the difference? But evolutionists know that their arguments would be even less tenable to laymen if the times were shortened too much for them.
We say humans are very complicated and a sponge or a jellyfish would be very non-complicated. But it's really funny because a jellyfish, or at least the sea anemone, has got about the same number of protein-coding genes as people. So in all these billions of years of supposed evolution, we actually haven't increased the number of genes hardly at all. And a lot of the genes that they have that we thought at first was something specific to vertebrates or specific to higher life forms, they have them also. So the evolutionists are scratching their head. The simplest cell is utterly complex. The simplest life out there is so mind-bogglingly complex that to me, it's impossible to conceive that it just spontaneously evolved from random chemicals. There is an unbridgeable gap between the simplest cell and random chemistry. It's sort of like saying, oh, well, we can find, if you go out in nature, you can find a rock sitting on top of another rock. Just from natural processes, you know, maybe fell off the cliff and landed on top of another rock. And because you can find rocks sitting on top of rocks, that explains the Great Pyramids. Well, of course, that's ridiculous.
We have decay. We have the second law of thermodynamics. I look in the mirror every day, and it's hitting me with a vengeance. Yeah, we've been told that if our theories ever run counter to the second law, we can be pretty sure they're not right. The second law basically tells us that at least a closed system, everything goes downhill. Things fall apart. They don't spontaneously self-assemble over the long haul. The evolutionist tries to get out of this by arguing that the Earth is an open system, that energy keeps impacting on the Earth from the sun, and that this energy sort of drives the evolution uphill and causes entropy then to decrease rather than increase. This is really not a good argument. We know that energy is necessary for the assembly of complex things. That's true in an automobile plant. Without energy, the plant comes to a halt. But energy by itself is the necessary but not sufficient condition of, say, making automobiles. One needs information, you need programs, you need sequences, things have to be done in a certain order, parts have to arrive at a certain time, have to fit other parts. There's an integration of complexity. Energy alone is not sufficient to explain it.
The Achilles heel in evolutionary theory is a lack of transitional species. There should be millions of transitional species. There should be tremendous numbers of transitional species between the major groups of animals, but there aren't. In fact, you got the Cambrian explosion where all the major phyla of life, the biggest differences that exist, they just poof, appear out of nowhere with no transitional species. You've got Darwin saying that he's leaving up to future generations of geologists to discover all the innumerable transitional species that must exist. But since the 1960s, the fossil record's changed by about 4%. So what they have is a handful of disputable transitional species. Those transitional species they use today were not the ones they used in the 1970s. It's not the ones they used at the 1925 Scopes trial. It's not the ones that Charles Darwin had in his day. Each transitional species seems to have a shelf life of maybe 10 years. And then it's kind of quietly shuffled off to the side, and they think of something else, and something else is brought up as a transitional species. And we had the famous Evolution of the Horse series. Everyone remembers that, the little horse and the big horse. That's not found in the textbooks anymore, and if it is, it shouldn't be, because that's been routinely and soundly discredited. And a lot of the other things that people would remember as the best evidence for evolution really turned out to be no evidence at all.
Charles Darwin did the same thing when he thought of his idea of evolution. He saw that the facts of the fossil record did not line up with his theory, and so he made a very unscientific decision. He decided to hold on to his theory and ignore the facts. The same thing happened in the 21st century. Mary Schweitzer said in Discover magazine, April of 2006, quote, "I had one reviewer tell me he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back